bits of overtime. Praise him whose wars we love to fight. Praise him, fat leech and parasite. Amen.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Bougie Horror Podcast Show. This is your host, Ellie Zara, along with my friend, Luke St. Peter. Say hi, Luke.
Hey, everybody.
We are going to talk about The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion in this episode. This is by Margaret Killjoy, fairly popular in the anarchist space for her work on fictional bits of media. So we're going to talk about that. This was a pretty fun romp through what I would call, or just a term I totally made up, an anarchist realtopia. So it's not a dystopia and it's not a utopia. It's just kind of like real life, how things would probably turn out. So just a realistic community. So again, totally made up that term. Don't know if anyone else has used it before, but probably. Either way, it's in Freedom, Iowa, which I have in my notes. So what we're going to do, we're going to keep things pretty simple. We're going to go chapter by chapter and just talk about our thoughts, any notes we wrote down, and then we'll talk about our overall feelings on the book. Let's get it out of the way early. Luke, how did you feel about this book?
I actually feel pretty confident that all throughout the book is pretty good. Wouldn't say the ending's predictable, but I wouldn't say it's unpredictable either. I think it ended pretty well, and I think the story was solid.
Yeah, I agree. Overall, I liked this story. I thought it was solid. I wouldn't say it was amazing or anything. It felt perfunctory at times, but in general, I enjoyed it. Whenever there was political commentary, I thought it was generally on point, or at least thought-provoking. The characters were written well. There was some solid commentary on relationships and economics and lots of other stuff that we'll talk about as we make our way through the book. So I think Luke and I both agree overall this was a solid book. I didn't think it was anything incredible. It didn't change my life. It wasn't amazing or whatever. I didn't cry to it, but I did like it and thought it was solid. So let's start with chapter 1. The book is broken up into 8 short chapters. This is a novella, not really a novel. So I'm not really sure how long it'll take us to really discuss everything. But I think we do have a lot to discuss, given how political the book is and how political Luke and I both are. We start the book with our main protagonist, Danielle, not Danny, Kane. And she is on her way to Freedom, Iowa, to find what happened to her friend Clay. Now, I want to give some content warnings here. We're going to talk about some pretty serious shit throughout most of this episode, including topics of suicide, possibly topics of partner violence, just violence in general. So, this is going to be a pretty heavy, or could be a pretty heavy episode. The book also has all of those things and mentions of. So just keep yourself safe. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. Anyway, she's on her way to Freedom, Iowa, and she is looking for a friend, Clay, who has recently killed himself, and she's trying to figure out what's going on. So this is a pretty good hook. I thought it justified why she'd want to go so bad and why she would, she basically pulls a knife on this trucker guy. And one of the first notes I wrote down was about being nice versus being quote unquote nice. She talks about the truck driver basically trying to protect her and seeing her as like vulnerable because she's a hitchhiker and because, she's ostensibly a woman. And so he just wants to make sure she's not doing anything stupid, but he's also trying to make decisions for her when she's a full-grown adult. Danielle is like 28. So, full-grown adult, able to make her own decisions, and he's trying to make those decisions for her. So it's kind of like a nice versus nice thing, especially shown when, he calls her a fucking bitch after she gets out of the car. So, there's a veneer of like, I want to protect you, I want to keep you safe. But under that veneer is like just disdain and revulsion towards women who want to take care of themselves. Although I think after this book, I came away thinking like, well, maybe Danielle should have listened to him. But either way, did you make anything out of this little interaction at the beginning here, Luke?
Talking about content warnings. Here's another content warning for you about sexual stuff. I thought, now it wasn't explicitly written there, so my thought could be false, but I thought maybe the guy wanted to possibly sexually assault her or possibly even rape her.
Mm,
Because he was kind of like quote unquote owed something for
right.
being nice. So it was going back on what you said about being genuinely nice versus being quote unquote nice. Of course, that could be something that the author didn't intend to be written there, but that was my impression.
Yeah, I didn't pick up on that, but he does lock the door on her and is obviously trying to keep her inside against her will. So not good, no matter what's going on there. Yeah, I didn't pick up on that, but that's an interesting interpretation and definitely something that could have been going on. It's obviously something, if you're a hitchhiker, you'll have to deal with is possible violence against you. But yeah, he said that he would let her out to at like a Walmart or something, and she does say later on that there is a Walmart near the community. So I just kind of took him at his word, but there's definitely could be subtext where he's just trying to keep her where he can. So we don't know. It's a pretty quick exchange, so we don't know for sure. But either way, not a great guy, not a nice guy, not a nice guy, but a nice guy.
Right.
Either way. One thing I thought that was funny about the early section is, and we'll talk about this later too as we get more into the politics of the book, but she talks about how hitchhiking has become like a job for her and how she used to enjoy it a lot more when she was younger. And I just thought that was kind of funny because I've never really thought about hitchhiking as like a job type thing. So Danielle says, but a decade is an awfully long time, and whatever shine I'd found on the shit that is hitchhiking had long since faded. Still, it got me where I wanted to go. So I just found this fascinating. I don't know a lot about hitchhiking culture, and it's not a subject I've ever really looked into or thought about. So it just kind of amuses me that even something as adrenaline pumping as hitchhiking could become a job and become kind of menial and just like part of your daily life. That's so foreign to me, although I've moved around a lot in my life, but never through hitchhiking.
Right. Yeah, I've never had to hitchhike, but then again, I'd be too scared to hitchhike, you know. So
Right. Yeah, no, same. I would rather walk probably. Either way, this is where I started noting about a Realtopia. I noted it fairly early, and it's a place called Freedom, Iowa. I didn't look up whether this was a real place. I don't know if you did, Luke. I don't think it is. Pretty sure it's just it's just an idea from the book. There is a Freedom Township in Iowa, but that's about it. So I'm pretty sure it's all just made up. The two-headed deer is going to probably give away that it's fictional anyway, right? To some extent.
yeah,
Regardless, yeah, so she gets to Freedom, Iowa. She falls asleep on this porch and she talks about how whenever she's awake, she's feeling nostalgic and, and like sad. But when she's asleep, she's kind of like in a stupefied state and she's kind of happy and she's like thinking about various things, but she can't make sense of it. So I thought that was like an interesting look into her as a person. I know being in my 30s now that I deal with a lot of nostalgia. I just the other day, actually yesterday, Hulu and Disney had this advertisement for like throwbacks, and it was all stuff from the 90s. And on a completely unrelated note, mostly when I wake up in the morning, I wake up with back pain, so that's fun. But anyway, so yeah, it's just kind of wild getting older and like looking at the stuff that you grew up with and people seeing it as like throwback stuff. It's very weird. So I could kind of relate to what Danielle was talking about there.
yeah. I thinking about throwback stuff. So my job sells a lot of different types of clothes, and one of the clothes we were selling were some members only jackets. Um, and different jackets had the characters from different kids cartoons on them.
Right.
And I got myself a Rugrats one, and everybody who's been in their 30s, maybe early 40s, just loved the jacket. And that's a total throwback. And I've probably gotten more compliments on that jacket than I have on any other article of clothing I've ever owned. Um, so yeah, definitely when you're in your 30s, you have nostalgia for things.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I remember watching Rugrats when I was younger too. She says, this is the quote I'm thinking about. When I'm awake, I'm happy sometimes, but I don't know that I'm ever as happy awake as I am when I'm sleeping. Awake, I've got all this nostalgia. This is the part I really like. This feeling that I'm separated from something I can smell but can't touch. I totally got that. Like sometimes I get these like images from being younger or these memories, and I just feel like I'm really close to being able to like remember what that was like, or taste it or smell it or interact with it in some sensory way, but I can't touch it. I can't go back to it. And, you don't have a time machine and stuff like that. And if I did have a time machine, I'd do other way more other things than that. So I get these sudden. This is Danielle again. I get these sudden, unbearable realizations that I should have been more present during all those moments in my life. That I should have taken the time to be like, oh shit, man, this is my life and it's fucking awesome sometimes. Dreaming, I just swim in the joy and the intensity and the nowness of my life. It's very interesting to me. I don't know how much I can relate. My dreams are often very vague and I don't often remember them. But when I do, I mean, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. They're usually just weird. And as I've gotten older, my dreams have either gotten weirder or just been like obviously bad or obviously good. They're not like any kind of weird middle ground, I guess, except for when they are weird. But yeah, I thought this was cool. We learned that there is a rabbit in front of her, and its chest was a raw red wound. Wow, that's like a tongue twister. Its rib cage and organs gone. It smelled like death and blood, and I don't usually smell much in my dreams. So again, going back to that smell but can't touch nostalgia stuff.
Yeah.
So something's very wrong in this town, and we'll find out more about that in just a second. So yeah, she put on some black metal, which I thought was funny, and just fell asleep. So she gets woken up, and she immediately tells them that her name is Danielle, not Danny. So I thought that it's a thing that happens throughout the book where she constantly has to correct people's perceptions of her and her name, and that her name is not Danny, it's Danielle, because Clay lived in this community for a long time. He was a hitchhiker too, but as opposed to Danielle, who was always like just looking for the sake of looking, Clay was actually looking with a purpose, right? He wanted to be somewhere. He wanted to have a community to put his feet up on and just relax and just like have a place to call his own, put in some hard work when he has to, so on and so forth. So immediately we have a discussion about pronouns. I thought this was cool. The guy who finds Danielle says, I'm Vulture. He says, what pronouns do you prefer? And it's just a very nonchalant conversation. And they just introduce each other. I think it's great. It's much ado about nothing when people discuss pronouns and stuff. I think the way the book handles it, especially from a trans author, was very nice. It's just very basic. There's not much to say. It eventually becomes kind of a meeting between, I mean, not really friends, but he knows her through Clay. So they end up talking about, Clay and stuff like that. And I thought one of the little quotes here that I liked was that she was talking about the love seat and how they're crammed onto a love seat, lounging atop one another in a way that punks and puppies do. I thought that was very nice alliteration, and also just a very cute picture, but a very funny one too. So we meet the main cast, the Days, aka Thursday and Doomsday, and we also meet Bryn, yeah, the tattooist, who Danielle kind of has a relationship with. It's kind of complicated, but we'll get into it. What did you make of the kind of setting here, the house, and just the characters, Luke?
Like the house in particular and the community in general, like the whole concept reminded me of the idea that nobody should be richer than its poorest community member type of thing. And so they didn't have like the same kinds of luxuries that you might expect out of an upper middle class family or whatever. But they also had enough to be able to survive and even thrive a little bit, which I
Right.
thought was interesting. And later in the book, too, we'll see how they operate with commerce. It kind of reminded me of that communist idea from each according to their ability to each according to their need.
Yes.
Um, and so that Marxist concept kind of ran through the whole book. I
Yeah,
noticed.
we'll talk about that more as we talk about the really free markets and stuff about economics later on.
Yeah, absolutely. So those were my initial thoughts on the whole thing.
One little thing I thought was cool here, I forgot to denote it, but I did note it while I was reading and looking back. It's pretty cool. They have mirrors everywhere, so it's kind of a organic way to let the daylight reach into the corners, where you might not be able to otherwise. Because, if it's not clear already, this is a largely abandoned community in Iowa. So I think this is like the one big political thing I wanted to talk about in this chapter. So Danielle asks them where they get certain things. Let me see if I can find this quote. So she says, "Where do you get the gas?" And Vulture demurred, "We buy it at Walmart, only place to get pretty much anything within a 2-hour drive." So this is an interesting thing that all anarchists have to deal with. Any political radical. You don't have to be an anarchist to have to deal with this kind of thing, right? We live in a complicated capitalist world where we have to give our taxes to a state that we're getting really political real fast, but we have to give our taxes to a state that is bombing houses, bombing children. They are giving, corporate handouts. They're cutting, relief in funds and supplies for the poor. They're doing lots of terrible things. They're arming the police against, marginalized communities. And also, we have to often shop at places that we don't necessarily like or agree with. So when I'm shopping, I often pick a store that I like, the most out of a bunch of ones that I like the least, right? So I used to shop at Target, but they've rolled back their Pride stuff, and they also rolled back some, quote unquote DEI stuff, diversity initiatives, basically diversity equity initiatives, I believe it stands for. And so that made me think, okay, I don't want to shop at Target anymore as much as I can. I'm very lucky. I live in a city where I have a lot of options. I haven't shopped at a Walmart in years, and I'm
Right.
pretty against Walmart. They're a monopoly, and they often push out smaller businesses. They get their cheap labor from other countries, often with sweatshops. So it's just a bad situation to be in if you're in a small town like this, a very small
Yeah.
town. I think that there's definitely an impulse from outside the community, outside anarchist communities, to be like, "Oh, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites. Why don't you just do everything by yourself?" Which is just completely unreasonable, right? And the
Yeah.
whole point of capitalism is like we're kind of forced into it, right? We can't just opt out. Or if you try to opt out, you have to rely on it to some extent while trying to make yourself self-sufficient, which is what they do. To some extent, they are self-sufficient, but to another extent, they need, Walmart because it's the only store in town that's, within a 2-hour drive. And 2 hours is a long way. Either way, I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts about this. I know, Luke, you and I have talked about Walmart before and sort of ethical consumption under capitalism. This is a big topic among anarchists. So go ahead if you have any thoughts.
With ethical consumption under capitalism, it kind of reminds me of the social work concept of harm reduction. That yet the end goal, the optimum goal, should be to have a completely ethical society. But until then, we need to do the least detrimental thing. And that covers a wide variety of things, whether it's vaping instead of smoking, whether it's like you did, you stopped at Target instead of Walmart until they rolled back the programs. Maybe it's supporting a smaller large business over a really large business. But I've also noticed that with anarchists and other radicals, at least on the left side of the spectrum, there is this, we all have this one business that we just don't want to have anything to do with. Like for you, as you mentioned, you haven't shopped at Walmart in years. My experience with Walmart working there for 3 months was that I was working two full-time jobs at the same time. And I was originally working at Walmart part-time, but they liked my work, so they promoted me to full-time without consulting me. And because I was working two full-time jobs, I literally almost died because of it, and not by suicide. I literally fell asleep behind the wheel. So Walmart's pure unadulterated evil, as far as I'm concerned. Sometimes I'll want to get an item, and maybe Amazon's my only resource for getting an item, or something like that. So, if the item is important enough that I have it, then I might have to get it through Amazon. But usually I try to avoid the worst of the unethical consumption under capitalism. And I think that's really just all we can do for now.
Yeah, I totally agree. There is no ethical consumption under capitalism, but we can always do better. We can always try to do our best to support local businesses. And by the way, local businesses are not a panacea either. Some small town shops are just as bad on their workers as a big corporate chain like Walmart is, right? Just because you're
Yeah.
a small business doesn't magically mean your boss is nice or nicer than a Walmart boss. In fact, they could be worse because you might have to deal with your boss on a daily basis more often and in much
Right.
more closer contact than Walmart. In fact, in bigger department stores, like I used to work at Kohl's, excuse me, Kohl's makes me feel sick apparently. When I was younger, I worked at this department store called Kohl's. Never saw my manager almost ever, except like maybe at the beginning of my shift and like once or twice during the shift. And I was pretty much left alone throughout a lot of it. Now, it wasn't a great job. I don't have fond memories of it. But what I do remember liking was that I could pretty much do my own thing and get left alone. And it was such a big store that it was hard to keep track of all the employees. And especially the hours I was working, which was often overnights or
Hmm.
late nights. So there are benefits to working in big corporate stores because you often see your managers a lot less. Either way, let's get off this tangent and move on with the book. Was there anything else about chapter one that you wanted to talk about before we move on to chapter two? So chapter two is where things start kicking off. There is a rot parade, the rot of death parade. I don't know, that's what I called it. But there's a bunch of geese, a goat. All these creatures have a wound where their rib cage had been, yet they're still alive. It's just really gross. They open their mouths to bellow and squawk and bleat, but their organless bodies let only strange rasps out. Paraphrasing. So yeah, it's pretty fucked up. And earlier, we didn't mention. I did mention the deer with two heads. It's also on the cover of the book, and it looks pretty gnarly. It's got red eyes too. That is a deer you would not want to run into. But either way, it's like a procession of death, which is pretty fucking metal if it wasn't real. But unfortunately for Danielle, it's real. So this guy is running away from it, and his name's Anchor. He eventually gets killed, and they eventually see the deer. It's a blood red deer, has three antlers and a sharp silhouette, and yeah, just the creature just fucking kills him. I think we find out later, or we do find out later, that the creature's name or the deer's name is Ulysses. I don't know if that's like a name that means something. They might have said what it means too, but I don't remember.
I don't
What's
recall
that?
them saying what it meant.
Yeah, I don't either. Ulysses sounds Norwegian to me, or
Okay.
European of some sort. Sounds like a Swedish name or something like that. But either way, the man collapses and Ulysses just fucking tears out his heart, Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom style. So I like that Danielle has an excuse why she doesn't immediately run away. She doesn't have a car. And so she is kind of trapped there. Vulture lets us know that these creatures are powerless at night. Now there's really no explanation. I don't think they ever give for why these creatures are powerless at night. You would think it'd be the opposite, that they would be powerful during the night and not as powerful during the day. But I do kind of like that subversion at the same time, that
Yeah.
you would expect a horror book to make your characters more powerful, make these beasties more powerful during the night, especially with the
Yeah.
blood red eyes, right? It would fit the theme more. But
Well,
instead, it's the complete opposite.
no, this is something that I had thought of with them being active in the day, and the author might not have meant this, but this is what I got out of it, was that everything comes out in the light of day, right? With Ulysses, we find out that it, attacks aggressors, right? And it only attacks when the sun's out. So it's kind of representative of the fact that everything comes out in the light of day,
Right.
so to speak. So they're So a person's bad deeds are shown in the light of day, and they're held accountable in the light of day, type of thing. And so I thought it was kind of representative of that.
So I love Danielle's reaction. What the ever loving fuck. So good
Right?
stuff. Just it's what you would say.
Yeah.
So they basically explain that, and here's the main plot, that these anarchist punks to take out this social venture capitalist, as I'm going to call him, Desmond, basically took over the town, and they either had to run or do a suicide mission of taking him on. And so some of them believed in magic. They were able to summon this spirit named Ulysses, and Clay was one of the people who helped. And eventually they killed Desmond, right? And so
Yeah.
Ulysses is this figure within the community that is largely loved because Ulysses keeps the community in order and is able to keep predators and cops and just punish the wicked. Basically, it's a sword of Damocles over your head if you, the audience, are familiar with the myth. And it'll fall on you the second you hurt somebody else. Now, we don't get super particular, like, okay, if I push somebody, is Ulysses going to come after me? Or is it just if I murder somebody, right? So
Right.
what's the process here? But we don't worry about that because most of the situations in here are not that small. Like if I told somebody to go to hell, would Ulysses be like, all right, well, that's strike one, buddy. I'm coming after your heart next. Um, but again, whatever. It's just nitpicking. One thing that Danielle she's really into is cooking for people. And so she kind of like rests on that throughout the book. And she has this cool line about how she doesn't like cooking for herself, but she likes cooking for other people. And that it gives her kind of a sense of calm and a sense of community. So I did appreciate that. I don't relate to it personally. I do want to go back to Desmond though. So they're talking about, Desmond, and they were talking about how there were 30 people who moved here at the start. 2 years ago in early spring, Clay was one of them. After a couple months when it looked like the place wasn't about to be cleared out, word went around. More of us showed up, mostly from Chicago. Now, Luke, tell me, is Iowa close to Chicago? I'm not good with my geography.
No, not really. When you
I
think
didn't think so.
Chicago, think Chicago is more of an Indiana, Illinois type of thing. It's right off
Right.
Lake Michigan, whereas Iowa's at the opposite end of the state.
Weird. Okay. So I think it was just a communal thing. For some
Yeah.
people, it was a free place to live. Other people, a place where anarchist ideals could be put into practice. Some of us came for our own reasons. It worked all right until Desmond. So this leads me into something I want to talk about with anarchism, right? So a
Yeah.
lot of people are concerned about power vacuums. This is something that gets talked about a lot, for example, in Batman, right? So Batman takes out a big crime lord, and then they're like, well, getting rid of me isn't going to do any good because another crime boss will just take my power, take my place, and they'll be even worse than me, right? So you get rid of the Joker, you get, I don't know, the Joker's doppelganger, who's even worse, does even more murder, is even more callous about it, right?
Yeah.
If that's even possible. So Thursday's talking about it and talking about Desmond, and I'm going to call this the Desmond problem. Motherfucker managed to take power. No one was supposed to be able to do that. That was the whole point. But I don't know. He got himself running the Security Council, then just about everything else. He did some good, scared some dudes off who were giving us shit, but power, man. Power does fucked up things to people.
Yeah.
Attracts fucked up people in the first place. So this is one of the issues with a I want to say a very socially motivated anarchist community. I'm not saying by a problem, I'm not saying it's unsolvable. I'm just saying it's difficult to work around, right? So
Yeah.
one of my issues with anarcho-communism is that it's rife for someone with very good social capital and very good social affectation who is good at manipulating people to basically get what they want, right? To be able to do exactly what Desmond does in this novella. Now, Danielle is joining after Desmond's already been taken care of, but at the same time, it's an issue that I see when anarcho communists are talking about their ideal community. Because I always worry about people who are neurodiverse, being neurodiverse myself, people who do not have good social skills, who might want to be further away from the community, who are introverted or autistic, especially. Again, a lot of this is self motivated. I'm introverted and autistic, so I'm not going to be like I'm not going to be coy about it, like, or pretend that I'm not biased, right? A lot of these problems are problems that I would personally have. It's why I
Yeah.
gravitate more towards mutualism or even individualist anarchism in my more pessimistic moods about humanity. Regardless, this is an issue that people have talked about with anarcho-communism. I wanted to see what you thought about it because the Desmond problem, it's something about social capital, and anarcho-communists are quick to criticize capitalism and usually quick to criticize the state, but they're not as quick to criticize social dynamics when it comes to social capital and being very like basically having community run by all the extroverted people sounds like a fucking nightmare to me. One that is run by a lot of introverted people sounds like it would be not good either, right? So you'd want to have a mix, but how do you do that? So Luke, any thoughts about the Desmond problem?
One of the quotes I have written down, unfortunately, I forgot to label chapter, so we might not have come across this in chapter 2 yet. But the quote I have written down is they say they want to make the world better, but they're just supplanting one authority for another. And they'll fucking murder anyone who tries to stop them because that's what power does to people. I believe in a messy, imperfect world where we just collectively or individually figure things out. So, it kind of goes back to what you were saying about market anarchism or individual anarchism, that you've got to have a society that works for everybody, not just the ones who can easily build social capital. And kind of like back on what you were saying is that like everybody says anarchism won't work because you've got the power vacuum thing going on where one person or person A is gotten rid of and person B replaced them and is even worse. And it goes back to another quote that I have written down from the novella, which is people always say anarchy can't work because you can't trust people to rule themselves.
Yes.
To which I've always said, if people are as untrustworthy as all that, how can you trust them to rule one another? You can't.
Exactly.
And then, which goes back to a quote that I took from a book that shall not be named, where one of the main characters, I modified the quote by attaching a certain ending to it that wasn't there before. The original quote was, humans do have a knack of choosing precisely those things that are worse for themselves. And then I add, so why should they be trusted to choose for others? Yeah, it's true that in anarchism, things are going to mess up, but things mess up worse when you give people undeserved power.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better, Luke. Yeah, that was one of my I'm really glad you brought up that quote because that was one of my favorite quotes from the book. And it's a great point that anarchists make against people who are saying, well, we can't trust people to govern themselves. And then you can just turn around and say, well, if we can't trust them to govern themselves, how the fuck can you trust people to govern other people? Like, if we
Right.
don't care about enough about ourselves to govern well, then why the fuck would we care enough about other people, right?
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of intuitive sense. I think this is a really good response. It may not convince everyone, but I think it's a great response. And it's one that really speaks to, yeah, Desmond's terrible, but Desmond is like one of the worst cases for an anarchist community. But one of the worst cases for like a state-run community is, genocide, military intervention, imperialism, like taking over the fucking world, nukes, exponentially worse. It's that old quote about Hitler being reduced to a local town bully that everybody just beats the shit out of and then kicks out or kills, whatever, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't have the kind of power. He doesn't have the German state to fucking, seize control of through racial hatred, right?
Right.
So it's not like, again, I'm not saying that anarchism is perfect or that the Desmond problem isn't real. It definitely is, but it's something that you can work with. And I don't think you have to summon demon deers to deal with people like Desmond, but it doesn't hurt, obviously. So I love this quote. Welcome to Freedom, Iowa. For the past year, we've had this benevolent murder spirit watching over us, which is weird, but it's going to be fine. So yeah, Desmond eventually got killed by Uliski. That's what I mean by them taking care of him. Desmond's crew then fucked off, and Uliski stayed. So that brings us basically to where we are right now. And the next part of the book Chapter 3 is going to a funeral. Anything else you wanted to say about chapter 2? Let me check my notes, make sure I got everything too. Yeah. Anything else you wanted to add, Luke, before we move on to chapter 3?
No, I've covered everything I can think of.
Great. Yeah, so we'll talk more about the politics of anarchist community in the future chapters. And for now, we will take a look at chapter 3. So for chapter 3, it starts off with, and I quote here, 6 ski-masked figures hoisted a pine coffin to their shoulders because apparently I was in the kind of squatted town where people have pine coffins lying around in case someone gets murdered by the local pet demon. Another very funny line during objectively horrifying events. I was thinking about how funerals would work in a town like this and how you would just have pine coffins lying around. They never really get into the world building of like, okay, this is how funerals work in this town, but it's not really a bit of building that you would think about anyway.
Right.
It's not super important, but I was kind of amused by the fact that they just had pine coffins on tap. So after that, they head to a really free market, which is something I have been to. So the next scene, we see an everything for everyone kind of free market, a really free market. So I've been to these before, not a ton of times, but definitely at least once or twice I've been around enough anarchists and specifically anarcho-communists to be around one. Luke, have you ever seen one of these before?
No, I have not, but I have heard of them. Uh, so but I have no direct experience with them.
Right, right. I think they're a cool idea. I also think that they are conflating, probably on purpose. I don't think it's disingenuous necessarily, but they're conflating free economically with free socially. Not that the two can really be separated necessarily. But when people are talking about free markets, right, they're typically not talking about products being free. They're talking about people being free within those markets, right?
Mm,
And I don't see currency as inherently limiting on our freedom necessarily. I see it as a good way to, bartering and exchanging goods and services isn't inherently a bad thing to me. I think certainly it can lead to the accumulation of wealth and the centralization of economic privilege, and obviously capitalism bad, right? But I don't
right.
think inherently you have to have only really free markets. I think you can have, to some extent, you can also have goods and services sold. I think you could even do it right next to each other as long as you keep things very explicit. In fact, I think it's better if you have a multiplicity of economic systems within a community. I think it helps keep the other balanced, right? Because if you have a
Yeah.
place where you can get free stuff, where you have mutual aid, where you have places where you can get funds from community members and stuff like that, but you also have a place where you don't have to rely as much on the community. You can, go to an employer or you can sell stuff that you own. Everything eventually comes down to the community or at least to the planet, right? Because eventually you have to get resources from somewhere. But I think it's best if they balance each other out. But Luke, what do you think?
I would agree with on a fundamental level with what you're saying that, it's best to have a multiplicity of things. I mean, like you were saying, I can certainly see how having a type of currency can lead to the accumulation of wealth, and thus it can lead to a certain kind of oppression that a cashless society might not readily have. Um, but at the same time, like you were saying, it does make bartering and trading easier, especially when the currency is something that's not readily used as something other than currency. Kind of like how the stereotype for a prison is where you have cigarettes as a currency. The thing about that is that cigarettes can easily be used for smoking and other things. And that has its own pluses and minuses as far as using it as a currency for. Yeah, I would say that, like you were saying, that if you have the mutual aid sort of thing, but at the same time have currency side by side with that, that's probably for the best in the long run. It gives people the option of whatever works best for them.
Right. I completely agree. I think also it's worth noting that although cashless societies won't have to deal with the centralization of wealth in an economic sense, what we will keep coming back to, especially in this part of the review, is the accumulation of social capital, and the book even acknowledges it. So this is a long-standing issue in anarcho-communist societies or theory where, because they don't rely on trade as much in terms of using a centralized means of currency, right? Which you don't necessarily have to. You could have different ones in different communities or shared conversion values and stuff like that. But I digress. Either way, you could still have an accumulation of social capital, and they eventually talk about this in this chapter, right? So we'll get to that. So eventually Danielle makes her way to the graveyard, the funeral, and she sees that there are some graves that are already there. A couple of them have like a version of her name, which is which she says is a fun coincidence. What a great evening I was having. So another lovely little side tangent that lightens the mood while something really terrible is going on. I also wanted to talk about the ethics of burying. So I know this is something that you've already thought about, Luke, but
Yeah.
the reason I'm bringing this up is they're talking about at one point how Danielle's old friend, he was buried in this kind of field of wildflowers near a tree or something like he would have loved. But it would have also been nice to be in a place that his mother could actually come visit so she could grieve a bit more properly and able
Hmm.
to deal with the emotions of losing her son. So, yeah, if you have any thoughts about, kind of the ethics of burying in general, but also if you want to talk about what they mentioned in this chapter, that's fine too, of course.
As you kind of brought up earlier, I've thought about my own burial, and like on the one hand, I would like to be cremated. I know in Christian circles, well, I should say mainstream Christian circles, there's this idea of the resurrection of the dead, which is why a good number of Christians prefer a whole body burial, prefer not to be cremated. But my argument in favor of cremation in that context would be that we shouldn't underestimate the power of God. Like, if he could resurrect Lazarus, he can resurrect us regardless of the state of our body. So there's that concept. But there's also, like you said, having a solid place to visit for family members and such, which I think you can still have without having a burial. Although to some people, it's nice knowing that the remains are in a particular spot too. So about the final ethics of burial, I'm kind of torn. I do have my own burials plot just in case my final decision is in favor of burial. Although I do understand how cremation is a more eco-friendly method of disposal of the body, especially when you can scatter the ashes in a number of different places legally, or even do so behind the government's back if you don't want to go through the legal means. Which I'm not even against doing that against or behind the government's back. Like, I feel like the regulations should be relatively loose when it comes to where the cremains go. So yeah, those are my thoughts on it.
Right. Yeah, and I agree with a lot of that. I think for the environment too, I'm not religious like you are, so although I do think it's very funny and ironic that some Christians would be like, well, then God can't bring you back. And like my atheist ass would be like, it's God. Like if God really does exist, God's not going to care if you're a bit of dust or bones and hollowed out skin, right? But
Right.
regardless, I also want to get cremated, and my reasons are I believe as far as I've done the research, it's better for the environment. I just prefer to go leave the earth in a way better than I found it, at least in one objective measure. I mean, I can't hope for the rest, Luke. It's all over for me in that way. But at least in
Right.
this way, they can go, well, she sucked, but at least she went out in a more environmentally conscious way. Good
Yeah,
press for
exactly.
me on my death, at least a little bit of good press.
Yeah, I certainly understand the more environmentally friendly, excuse me, argument in favor of cremation. When I was doing research into my burial, I think I actually saved it in my funeral notes even, that they can actually bury you or they'll cremate you, put you in with this lump of dirt, put this tree in the dirt and then plant the tree. To me, that's the most environmentally friendly way to be physically buried. If you didn't want your ashes scattered, is to actually like literally be planted in a tree, which I thought was cool.
Yeah, completely agree. That's a really cool thing to do. You see in movies too. I mean, I'm thinking about The Big Lebowski, so it's kind of not a serious reference, but
Right.
spreading ashes around in the sea and stuff like that as a form. I don't know if that's sanitary at all, but that's something that people like doing as well.
Yeah.
So the next quote I have is Anchor, I loved you. You're great. Anchor, of course, being the character who's just died, will stop the evil demon that probably wasn't an evil demon when you summoned it, but maybe it was, and it definitely is now, and maybe you shouldn't have summoned it. I really like this. It actually reminds me of I watched this series on YouTube called Reliving the War, which is the Monday night battle between WWE Raw and WCW Nitro. What wrestlers love doing is they love using brass knuckles,
Right.
and they the guy who runs Reliving the War loves to say he picks up a piece of brass knucks that don't look like brass knucks, but we'll call them brass knucks anyway. That kind of run on long humorous sentence kind of reminded me of this. Yeah, another good funny line. You got to have a lot of humor at funerals. I mean, I've only been at a couple funerals myself, but if you don't get humor, you got pretty much nothing. But
Right.
yeah, eventually anarchists, they love fighting even at funerals. Anarchists love to argue. And so eventually somebody's like, well, maybe it's better off that he's dead. And this guy called Eric Tall as fuck, I will call him nothing else. His name is Eric Tall as fuck, as I'm concerned. They're just basically what happens here in the plot is that they are trying to give homage to Anchor, but Eric Tall as fuck and some other people think Anchor must have done something fucked up to get killed by Uliski, while other people are like, well, fuck you. Like, even if that's true, it's kind of the inappropriate time to do that at his fucking funeral, right? When we don't have any
Yeah.
concrete proof. So they're going back and forth about that, and eventually, during all the arguing, Vulture and Bryn leave Danielle alone, and so she ends up talking to Eric Tall as fuck. And so this is where they start talking about social capital, right?
Mm.
So Danielle's talking about a town built on trust alone. So it's a everything for everyone. I talked about this earlier. It's a kind of mix of grocery and thrift store without cash registers or clerks. There is no money, no accounting, no ration cards, nothing, she says. Again, trust is a great thing. I love that there can be in an anarchist society communities that work on trust, but I feel like trust is also can also be easily manipulated, right? It's also something that could be easily flexed by people who are more extroverted, people who are more charismatic, people who have more friends and more connections, etc., etc. You get what I'm saying?
Yep.
So it's something to worry about. And they even acknowledge the kind of social capital stuff when she's asking, how do you get stuff like this? And Eric Tall as fuck says because no one has any authority over anyone else, no one is trying to accumulate material goods, political sway, or even social capital to wield against anyone else. Now, Danielle says she says to herself that she admits that's the world she wants to see. And Eric Tall as fuck says that people can't. We've talked about this quote before. It's a great quote, and it's a good quick comeback. But people always say anarchy can't work because you can't trust people to rule themselves. To which I've always said, if people are as untrustworthy as all that, how can you trust them to rule one another? You can't. Now, I want to go back to something Eric Tall as fuck said. He says, no one is trying to accumulate material goods, political sway, or even social capital. Now, in this conversation, I do agree no one is trying to accumulate material goods, right? He's not trying to get anything monetarily out of Danielle, but he's absolutely trying to get something political and social out of her in this conversation. Would you agree with that, Luke?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he's trying to manipulate her so that she can turn against Bryn and Vulture and the other people she's met, so that he can better take over the town and keep Liski in charge. I mean, it's all about the politics and social stuff. This is what I mean about anarcho-communist societies. Not that this one's a perfect one or whatever, but they run this risk, right? And if
Yeah.
you're blind to it, and if you're saying, oh well, nobody's trying to fight for social or political sway because we're all anarchists here, you're just denying generally what happens with you. I'm not going to say human nature because I don't really believe in human nature. I believe I'm more in the incentive model camp where I think basically you can have human beings, and this is very philosophical, but you can have human beings behave better or worse according to the incentive model that is going on, right? I don't really think people are inherently evil or good or whatever, right? I think you can
Right.
even point at the most evil of people, right? You could point at Hitler or Stalin or Mao or whatever, and you could see reasons for why, not justifications, right? Reasons and justifications are different, but I think you can look at it and see why they turned out the way they did, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, some people, have biological imbalances, and those cause them to be this or that. But even in a lot of those cases, you can still use medicine, you can still do therapy. I think the extreme cases where there's absolutely no hope for redemption or for any kind of improvement, and I'm just talking little bits of improvement, I think are
Yeah.
pretty minor when it comes to humans. So I don't
Yeah.
know what you think about that, Luke, but that's just my take.
I do want to make one comment.
Sure.
I agree largely that there's not all that much behavior that could qualify as human nature, but I would say that the fact that behavioral dysfunctions aside, the normally human responding to incentives is human nature.
Mm,
Um, that yes, there are mental illnesses, intellectual abilities, this, that, or other, that are going to affect how a person responds to incentives. But the very fact that most humans naturally respond to normal incentives is one of the few things that I would say is human nature. I would also say that ability and desire to communicate using language is another facet of human nature. Like I said, though, I don't think there's very much that actually qualifies legitimately as human nature, but there's like a short list of very fundamental things that I would argue is human nature, and responding to incentives is one of those things.
mm. Well, I don't want to drag us down too deep into philosophical territory, so I think we'll leave it there. But I
Sure.
think I think you've definitely made a good point. So we'll move on from that and talk about how. So eventually, Eric Tall as fuck is sucking on cigarettes like in a movie, which Danielle says is ridiculous. Basically, Eric Tall as fuck is trying to use Danielle to get Doomsday to leave, and he kind of conjectures again that maybe Anchor did something. There are also like whether Anchor tried to summon a worse spirit to take control. There's one part that I want to talk about this as well towards the end of this chapter, right? So eventually, Danielle does meet back up with Bryn and talks about how what's good about the community. And Bryn says that there's no cops, no bosses, no landlords, no poverty, no laws, hard work and community and freedom and all that shit that we ought to have. I think it was the work part that scared my partner off, but it's not enforced. There are a couple of people who just skate by. Mostly, we figure out ways to contribute. This is another issue besides the social capital stuff that I've always had with anarcho communists and anarcho communism and
Yeah.
communism in general. I think it valorizes labor too much. And when I'm talking about hard work and labor and effort, right? Obviously, Luke and I are putting a lot of effort into this podcast, right? Because we care about it. I put a lot of
Right.
effort into my job, and I put a lot of effort into, video games or whatever, right? Especially like really challenging ones. So I'm not against effort, right? And I'm not against putting things into motion that you care about, that you're invested in. But I do think valorizing or kind of deifying or reifying effort for the sake of effort or for the sake of community can be a dangerous thing. I'm not saying it's always bad, and I'm not saying there's no community that's worth hard work. I do get a little nervous when anarcho communists talk about how hard work is, for the community is great and it's fine because it's not enforced and there are people who just skate by, right? I do think that there are concerns here because obviously you have people who are going to be in a society, in anarchist society, you're going to have people who are elderly, disabled, or children, right? And maybe those people
Right.
just won't work and they'll just get by with community funds, mutual aid, people just helping each other, right? Just with no money involved at all. So obviously there are options, but still I worry about those kind of people in the same way that I worry about when we talk about social capital. I worry about introverted, autistic, neurodivergent people. So Luke, what do you think about this kind of conversation here? Do you agree that sometimes anarcho communists can valorize work for the sake of work, or do you think I'm off base here?
Oh, I don't think you're off base at all. Like, I can understand that under normal circumstances that people should, well, I shouldn't say should have the ability or the option to provide labor. But then there are those people who, for whatever reason, can't provide normal labor. Whether it's because they can't physically do any labor or they can't mentally provide a normal, quote unquote, normal amount of labor for quote unquote normal amount of time. Like, for example, I'm under doctor's orders for no more than 30 hours a week, no more than 4 days a week, and at least 12 hours between shifts. Most people don't need those doctor's orders, but I do. So, but people who are under those kinds of doctor's orders shouldn't be denied by the community a standard of living just because they can't happen to produce a normal amount of labor for whatever the reasons may be.
Right. And I do think also that they skate by isn't much of a winning endorsement, right? If I have a lot of trouble meeting the standards of the community, maybe they're unfair, maybe they're not. And I'm not just talking about people who are slackers, right? I'm a bit of
Right.
a slacker, or at least I consider myself one. Although currently I'm working a 40-hour work week, so not much of a slacker during the summer. But I love what I do and I get paid really well for it. So I'm not like mad at it, even if I'm exhausted and I wish I wasn't, right? I wish I didn't have to work this much. I would gladly work half as much for the same amount of money if I could, but regardless, skating by isn't that much of a winning endorsement, right? And
Right.
people should be able to still flourish while not meeting the standards of your communities. And so that's kind of my issue here. One of my main issues is like, well, they skate by, they get by okay. And I'm like, that's not really a life. I'm not going to say it's not a life worth living, but it's not as good of a life as you should have, right? And I mean,
Yeah,
if they do
absolutely.
zero work and they should be able to do the work, that's one thing, right? And they just can't at all. But it's very unclear. It's very vague. And even for those people, I mean, I just don't think that we should just abandon people just because they don't, just because they're lazier than we want them to be, right? And if we are
Yeah.
really serious about mutual aid and supporting each other, then we need to figure out, okay, why are these people not contributing? Are there mental health issues going on? Are there physical disabilities? Are they just not invested in the community? Like sometimes you're not invested in the community because it sucks. So like maybe that's a part of that is making the community better, so people want to give more to it. So, any other closing thoughts you have on this chapter? I think we've got about we've done about most of the chapter. It ends with Danielle having a panic attack, I believe,
Yeah.
and they talk about her. I've only had a panic attack I think once in my life when I was a teenager, and I've never had it since. And I don't know if you have any experience with that or feel comfortable sharing it, Luke. But it's not a fun experience. Obviously, it's kind of
Yeah.
like I remember it was like hard to breathe, and I was just freaking out like mentally and physically. It was nuts.
Yeah. Actually, when my one panic attack I can remember offhand, I was living on my own and I was seeing a therapist. I wasn't seeing a psychiatrist at the time, although I should have. And it was in the middle of winter, and because of the nasty weather, my therapist had to cancel the appointment. And because the appointment got canceled, I ended up having a panic attack. And it wasn't good, like you were saying, it really wasn't good at all. So when a person says they're having a panic attack, whether or not I can understand the reason for the panic attack is irrelevant to whether or not I can and should have empathy for that person in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. But that about wraps us up for chapter 3 or part 3. We will look at part 4 up next.